At some point on a large project, you will need someone else or someone else's goods and services to supplement the capabilities of your own team. But how do you make sure you get exactly what you want and that you get good value? Well, the answer is procurement management. So, what is project procurement? Project procurement is the process by which we acquire goods and services from a third-party provider outside of our project. These can be goods and materials, parts and components, assets or equipment. Or it could be consultancy, professional advice, contracted staff, or just services. Projects can procure goods and services either from within their own organisation or from an external provider. For external providers, of course, you'll need to enter into a legally binding contract. For goods and services provided from other parts of your own organisation, those are usually bound, if at all, by a service level agreement or SLA. There are many different types of contracts that govern the way we procure goods and services and the way that we pay for them. And I am not a legal expert, so this is a brief introduction to the core ideas. Within your organisation, you're likely to have procurement specialists and indeed legal experts who will help you to get the contract form right. Let's look at 6 basic types of procurement contract that are common enough in the project world. The first is a fixed price contract. You will pay a fixed price for the goods and services agreed, which means all the risks to delivery sit with the contractor or the provider. This, of course, means they will have priced that risk into their costs, and therefore you will be paying potentially a higher price for the goods and services to reflect the risk that the supplier is taking. A variation on this would allow the supplier to secure a fixed price, but to also add on additional prices under certain contingencies. Sometimes this is known as a fixed price plus contract, or more verbosely, as a fixed price with economic price adjustment. The second type of contract is a fixed price with an incentive, or with a penalty. This type of contract adds a positive incentive, a bonus, or a negative incentive, a penalty, for the supplier to perform either to schedule or indeed ahead of schedule. Do note, however, that in some jurisdictions, penalty-based contracts are not legal. Next, we have the unit cost contract. This type of contract allocates unit costs to each component that the project might need to buy. You then buy as much as you want and pay the fixed tariff that is agreed at the start. And of course, if you're buying in volume, you should be able to negotiate a reduced unit cost. Often these are framework contracts where you buy from a catalogue. Fourth is the target cost contract. This type of contract shares the risk between the purchaser and the supplier. It sets a certain maximum price that the purchaser will pay, the target. If, however, the supplier can deliver below the target price, then the purchaser and the supplier will share the benefits. This approach to contracting, however, requires a high degree of openness and transparency about all of the costs. This is more than just about accounting. It's about making sure that you have a high degree of trust in the relationship between the project and your supplier. Number 4 is a cost plus contract. This is a type of contract that throws all of the risk onto the project. However, the advantage is that it allows the supplier to charge just their base rates without adding on a premium for risk. This means that rates can be lower with a cost plus contract than with most other sorts. This type of contract also requires high degrees of transparency and therefore trust, because of course the supplier will be declaring the costs it incurs so that the project will pay all of the costs plus an agreed supplier fee. This fee could be a simple additional fixed sum. It could be a margin on all of the costs. It could be an incentive or bonus based on the level of performance of the supplier. Or, of course, it could be some combination of all of the above. Finally, we have the all-familiar time and materials contract. This, again, places all of the risk on the project, but it reduces the burden of administration and oversight. The supplier will charge for its service based on a schedule of rates agreed in the contract and the time that it has deployed those services. This is very much the equivalent of a unit cost contract, but this time for services rather than for materials or goods. The materials part of a time and materials contract refers to any costs that the supplier incurs in addition to the time that its people spend. This can include subsistence expenses, license fees, travel, or training costs. Let's move on to the how of procurement management. And procurement management follows a simple 4-step process: planning, procuring, monitoring and controlling, and closing. Procurement planning. You start by creating a procurement plan, which will cover a number of things: what you need to procure, the types of procurement you'll use, the detail of your procurement process, any formal procedures, policies, legislation or regulation that you need to follow, the forms of contract or service level agreement you're likely to use, the sources of legal advice, preferred pricing mechanisms, the quality standards that you'll apply to the products and services, and also the KPIs that you need your services to comply with, the team that will be responsible for procurement, and how your procurement process will fit in with the timelines of other parts of your project. Cost estimates for each of your procurements, the governance process that will sit over all of your procurement, your bid evaluation process, and the authorities who will be making each procurement decision and on what basis. Any preferences you have among making, hiring, leasing, or buying assets outright. Whether you have any preferred, shortlisted, or framework suppliers already, and how many vendors you intend to involve in the process. You may also have prime suppliers with subcontractors or an intention to contract all things directly. Then there's your attitude to partnerships or alliances, and critically, any ethical requirements. These include things like sourcing, energy efficiency, and matters of modern-day slavery, many of which are legal requirements in many jurisdictions. And finally, your plan might include any sample documentation or templates that you're going to use in the procurement process. When you get to the procuring stage, there are 2 main steps: specifying your requirement and then market testing to secure the best deal. To specify your requirements, you need to gather what those requirements are from your users or your customers or your experts, and then to document them carefully. This means setting out quality standards for products and performance standards or key performance indicators for services. You'll also document things like applicable legislation and regulation, and things like delivery times that you need to meet. Then you can move into market testing. This is the step where you find the best appropriate supplier through a competitive procurement process. This is referred to as either market testing, competitive procurement, or a tender process. And I have a video, which I'll put a link to in the description, called Competitive Procurement: How to Run a Tender Process. Once you've finished the competitive process and selected your preferred bidder, it's time to enter into negotiations to finalise the detail of the contract that you're going to award. If the negotiation goes well, your legal team and the supplier's legal team will work together to draft a contract that reflects properly your understanding of the supplier's bid. This contract will contain the terms that you agreed on, things like a statement of the work or the goods to be supplied, timescales and schedules, inspection and evaluation regimes, quality standards and key performance indicators, product support and maintenance, change control or variation order procedures, price, payment terms and, of course, payment schedules, penalties, if you use them and they're not legal in all jurisdictions, or bonuses, reporting processes, and any of the principal roles and responsibilities in the procurement or contract management process, confidentiality, intellectual property rights, data protection obligations, and how the contract may or may not be terminated. And then, of course, there's all those basic legal boilerplate things. Limitations on liabilities, warranties, insurances, performance bonds, assignments, dealing with disputes, and governing jurisdiction. Monitoring and controlling. Once you've entered into the contract, the work starts and the goods or services are supplied. Now, you need to monitor the contract performance. This is a mix of formal and informal activities that monitor your relationship with your supplier. It starts with administering the contract and making sure that both parties are fulfilling their obligations. Then there's monitoring performance against quality standards, performance standards, and KPIs. You may also carry out occasional formal procurement performance reviews. Going one step further, your organisation may also carry out a procurement performance audit. Of course, if there are any deviations in the performance of the contract, then you need to deal with those. Otherwise, you'll be making your payments against delivery and contract milestones. But of course, things also change, so there may be contract variations, variation orders, or changes that you need to process, or working with the supplier to get things right. And finally, that may of course mean updates to your plan and your documentation, and maybe also your budget. It's helpful to think of closing as a specific stage in your project procurement process. The basic closing tasks include things like ensuring that your suppliers have met all of their contract performance criteria, conducting formal handovers or acceptances, documenting and addressing any outstanding issues, any snagging, any claims or payments, ensuring you have all of the necessary documents for maintenance and for end-of-life procedures on major assets, finalising all payments and meeting all invoices, and attending to a formal contract closure, documenting and archiving the whole process. Finally, of course, carrying out a lessons learned review so that the project team can learn from the procurement process. Finally, it's worth saying a word or two about public sector procurement, because whilst public sector procurement follows the same basic process as all commercial procurement, often there are some additional rules, regulations, or legal constraints, and quite often there's also a requirement for a deal more rigour and transparency in the process. Public sector procurement in many countries is bound by national and often supranational legislation and regulation. These regulations impose obligations regarding things like fair competition, openness to bidders, reasonable timescales, and disclosure of certain information. Almost certainly, if you're conducting a procurement in a public sector organisation, you will need access to a large amount of policy, procedure, regulation and legislation. And you'll probably need experts to help you interpret it to make sure that you follow it. In the private sector, we're often far freer to buy from whomever we choose and to apply the contract form and conditions that suit us commercially. However, many of the best commercial organisations still apply procurement processes that are every bit as rigorous and transparent as those used in the public sector. One of the knowledge areas that project managers have to become familiar with is procurement. And one of the more complicated elements of procurement is running a tender process. So in this video, I want to answer the question, how do you deliver a tender process? Tender processes can be long and complicated, and they become longer and more complicated the closer you get to the public sector in most countries. That said, I'm going to divide the process up into 17 steps, but recognise that for your project and for your organisation, you may not need all of these steps, or you may be able to combine them conveniently. Why so many? Because by distinguishing steps, make it easier to understand exactly what's going on. And the first of these is to determine requirements. Figure out what it is that you need to procure through a tender process. Step 2 is to document those requirements, and you'll do that mainly in the tender documents, but possibly also in a draft contract. Now, you're going to need to evaluate the different bids you receive to comply with the tender. And in doing so, you need to recognise that all aspects of your requirements are not going to be of equal value and importance to you and to your stakeholders. So step 3 is to determine the relative priorities among all the components of your tender requirements. Examples will include things like quality, different aspects of the functionality, operational arrangements, timeliness, the all-important cost, and other commercial matters like the standing of the bidder. My recommendation is you gather together key stakeholders to determine the relative importance and therefore apply weightings to each component of the tender documents. And here is a simple plea from me. Please, please, please do not treat everything as being equally valuable and therefore simply award the tender contract to the cheapest, lowest bidder. Sometimes that will be appropriate. Sometimes you will have absolute standards of compliance or non-compliance on every component, and therefore a fully compliant bid is entirely acceptable, and the best thing to do therefore is to take the lowest price bid. But for many, many projects, this will be too simplistic an approach and will not be appropriate. What you're interested in optimizing is value, not cost. Cost on its own is only one component of value. Fourth, you need to create an evaluation framework so that you can evaluate the bids against your requirements. Often this takes the form of a scoring process that will score the responses to each requirement, possibly as either compliant or non-compliant, but again, often there are going to be degrees of compliance, and therefore a maximum score will be awarded to something that is totally compliant and offers everything we want. And then for bidders who are not able to offer everything we could possibly want, we might give them a lower score. When we multiply that score by the weighting, we create weighted scores which are used for evaluating the bids. Fifth, you need to set a tender deadline. This is the deadline by which bidders need to submit their tender documents. And as part of this, you also need to set the whole process timeline. There will be lots of key dates, possibly including the point at which you announce the preferred bidder. Sixth, you need to bring the opportunity to the attention of bidders. In many jurisdictions, particularly in the public sector, this will be through advertising, and advertising in trade journals or in specified documents. In the European Union, there's the official journal, which contains all public sector procurements. But if you're not going to advertise, you need to find suitable bidders and contact them and invite them to tender. Seventh, you might want some form of pre-qualification stage to find out whether prospective bidders are suitable and capable of providing what you need. And often this comes with a pre-qualification questionnaire, a PQQ. Bidders who are able to satisfactorily complete the pre-qualification stage will receive a formal ITT, invitation to tender, or an RFP, request for proposal. You will always be wise to secure as much assurance from prospective bidders that they are intending to tender as you can. That way you can know whether you're likely to have a competition with enough bidders to make it a proper competition and therefore properly competitive. If you don't get enough bidders, you will need to widen your net and invite more people to respond. At number 8, we need to create a bidder briefing. This will often take the form of briefing documents, a tender pack of some sort, but may also include an informal or formal face-to-face briefing session where you gather together the prospective bidders and you present to them and possibly answer their questions there and then. Number 9 may or may not happen. You need to determine whether you are going to answer bidders' questions and what the process will be. Often, you'll ask them to submit requests for information, RFIs, or TQs, technical questions or technical queries. It's good practice always to gather together all of their inquiries, to document them all, and then to respond with answers to all of the inquiries to all of the bidders. That way ensuring a level playing field and making sure that everyone knows as much as everyone else. However, if you're in the public sector, there will almost certainly be a set of rules with which you have to comply, and therefore those come ahead of any suggestions or guidance that I might give. 10th, you need to brief your evaluation team. They need to understand the context, they need to understand the tender documentation, and they need to understand the process by which they're going to evaluate bids against the documentation. What is the mechanism for scoring and how do they apply the weightings? Number 11 is to receive the bids, which doesn't sound like much, but it's very important, particularly in public procurement with rules, because they will often state that you may not receive and you certainly may not open a bid that arrives after the deadline. And I have had experience of waiting in the reception area of an office building for the last bids to arrive and having a timer with me. And yes, when a bid arrived late, I had to mark it as non-compliant and seal it in a locked room, never to be opened. The tendering organisation that invested a lot of its time and a lot of its money in putting together that tender received no value for its effort. We will never know, they will never know, whether their tender would have been compliant or even the winning tender. If you're ever on the other side of the transaction and putting together a tender, it is crucial that you think about the logistics of getting your tender to the right place at the right time. Number 12 is a big one. We need to evaluate the bids that we receive. Firstly, we will do a triage of every bid to ensure that all of them are compliant. Any bid that is non-compliant, either in terms of the process by which it has been created or the content, needs to get put to one side. The compliant bids can therefore be evaluated for their performance against the tender requirements. Inevitably, you will find uncertainties and you will need clarifications from the bidders around certain elements of their bids. Now again, the rules of your tender process may say that you may not see clarification, and if something is unclear, it needs to be scored in a certain way. However, if you are able to seek clarifications, that's step 13. And step 14 is to make the choice to select the preferred bid. This is often known as the most economically advantageous tender, or MEET. However, you may have a longer process still, that involves shortlisting and interviewing potential bidders from the shortlist before making your final decision about the most economically advantageous bid. That is to say, you will have a chance to clarify factors and receive additional information. Once again, with many public procurements, this stage is not allowed. However, in the commercial sector, often the pitch or the presentation is a vital part, particularly when we're looking at services which are driven as much by personality and confidence in the professionals as they are by objective facts. Step 15 is to notify your preferred bidder. And it's crucial here that you secure confirmation from your preferred bidder that they are prepared to go forward on the basis of their tender before notifying any other bidder that they have been unsuccessful. Because if they're not prepared to go through with it, you then need to revert to your second preferred bidder. At this stage, you will also need to prepare yourself to give feedback to the unsuccessful bidders. And again, your detailed processes and procedures may specify what you can and cannot say and how you can and cannot deliver that feedback. Step 16 will often have some form of contract negotiations to finalise the details of the contract. But remember, the bid itself will form a component of that contract, and therefore the contract has to be consistent with the bid. If during those negotiations the bidder tries to vary the terms of the bid, then you need to be prepared to go and evaluate whether under those varied terms the bid would still have been successful. Assuming the negotiations go well, then step 17 is where the whole tender process ends. It's when you sign the final contract and become contractually related to your new supplier. When you need to buy goods, services, or contracted work on a project, and you need to do so in a competitive way, then you need to manage a tender process. This means a lot of documentation. So in this video, I want to answer the question, what goes into project tender documents? Tender management is the process of identifying, briefing, evaluating, selecting, and appointing suppliers of goods and services to your project. The process will follow a formal procurement procedure. So you'll need to create tender documentation against which the bidders will be able to prepare their responses to your requirements. And therefore you will have a consistent basis against which to evaluate the different offers that you receive commercially. This will allow you to select your preferred supplier. The tender documents will describe the goods, the services, or the work that you require, and you'll support it with any background information that will be helpful to the bidders to understand what you need and the context in which you're operating. The more information you give, then the better the bids that they will be able to prepare, and therefore the higher confidence you will have in evaluating the supplier, and thus you will minimise the risk to the project. And of course, the tender documents will also outline the contractual relationship that you want to form between the project or the project organisation and the supplier. There are some things that I would expect all tender documents to address in one form or another. There are also some other things that I would expect that many tender documents will need to include in one way or another, but not all documents will have them. They will depend on context, on the type of project you're running, the type of organisation within which you're running it, and the sort of goods and services that you're procuring. A lot of this will also depend upon any local laws or regulations, or indeed any organisational policies and procedures that you need to follow. And don't forget that many nations are now part of larger trading blocs, which impose their own regulations too. The upshot of this is that preparing tender documents is a skilled task, and before starting, you should always take advice from a procurement specialist within your organisation. Often, the tender documents will accompany a formal letter inviting the bidders to offer their submissions, which is known as an ITT, an invitation to tender. Let's start with the set of things that almost every set of tender documents will include. Number 1, instructions for bidders. Specifically, this includes things like the form of the tender document, who needs to sign it, and any deadlines or milestones in the tender process. It will include how the documents need to be delivered and may include packaging instructions, and also can include a label or formal tender return slip that needs to accompany the package. Often, particularly in public procurements, the tender documents need to arrive in an anonymous way. It needs to be impossible to identify who the bidder is from the outside of the package. Sometimes this means that bidders are assigned a unique bidder identification number rather than using their own name on the packaging. In modern procurements, this can also mean using barcodes or QR codes on the tender slip. The instructions for bidders can also include logistics, things like the numbers of copies, formatting, and even a maximum length. And finally, they may also include ethical requirements that the bidders need to meet. Number 2, background information. Basically, the more context you give the bidders, then the better their bids are likely to be, specifically in terms of how they tailor their bids to your particular needs. Often, particularly on big projects, this section will refer bidders to larger, separate information packs that they can read and assimilate in preparing their bids. Number 3, evaluation criteria. This tells the bidder how you will be evaluating their bids, often including the criteria against which you will assess them and possibly even the weighting of each criterion. Again, this allows them to make sure they address what is important to you. If they fail to give sufficient weight to the things that you tell them are most important to you, then that's their lookout, and they're probably the wrong bidder for you. You may see this section referred to as award criteria. Number 4 is specification. This is the heart of your tender documentation. It sets out the specifications for what it is you need, the requirements you have for the work or the goods or the services that you're trying to buy. This section is also likely to cover things like the standards to which any work or products need to conform, along with sustainability or ethical or environmental concerns. And it will also include reference to how you intend to monitor the performance or the production of the work or products that are being delivered to you. Where appropriate, this section is likely to contain things like drawings and diagrams and charts that will help the bidders properly understand the needs of the tendering organisation. At number 5, we have an outline of the contract or an outline contract form. This will usually be a high-level articulation of the terms that you expect to put in the contract, the obligations and requirements, both on the successful bidder but also on yourself as the tendering organisation. There are other things you might expect to see in this section too. Things like KPIs or other performance measures, monitoring procedures, contractual deadlines or milestones, payment terms and processes, provisions for termination, and indeed for addressing and resolving disputes, and a statement of the governing law that you expect the contract to be written under. At number 6, I'd expect to see a contract monitoring section, although it may be included in either of the previous 2 sections that I've discussed. It sets out how you propose to monitor the performance of the successful bidder, either in delivering services or in delivering products. And finally, at number 7 is the contract award process. Once the bidders have submitted their tender, what will happen next? What's the sequence of events? What are you likely to require of bidders? And what's the likely timing? Once again, in public procurement, the timings may well be set down in legislation or regulation, and you have no leeway there. But of course, there are other things that you may need to or want to include in your tender documentation. First of these is either a statement of the governing law or regulations that apply to the tender, or indeed a copy of the relevant parts of that law or regulation. Second, there may be some relevant internal policies or procedures that your tender process will be adhering to and which you require of the bidders. But this can also include internal regulations, internal policies and procedures that successful bidders will need to comply with once the contract comes into force. These might include things like health and safety, equality and diversity, CSR or environmental policies, alcohol and substance abuse policies, data protection and data security policies, and indeed physical security policies too. And thirdly, we often see a standalone section these days on ethical and CSR requirements. CSR stands for Corporate Social Responsibilities, and this can often include environmental policies and environmental requirements that you're placing on your selected bidder. Fourth, if appropriate, there may be a blank pricing schedule for bidders to complete. This is effectively a pricing table that gives set prices for specific items of work or for specific products, so that once the contract is in place, you will know how much each unit of work or each unit of product or material will cost. Fifth, there may be heads of terms of what you intend to be the final contract, or indeed a draft final contract that bidders can review. In some contexts, you might ask them to comment on this. In others, it might be fixed and only subject to final negotiation, where you would expect that any changes are going to be minor. Sixth, there may well be confidentiality and freedom of information statements in your tender documents. And seventh, there may be some social value or community standards requirements in your tender. Is there anything else? Well, maybe. Bear in mind that every jurisdiction will have its own particular requirements. Every organisation will be different and every industry sector will have its own characteristics. That means that what I've listed as a general set of tender document contents may need to be supplemented by the particulars of your situation, and therefore there is no substitute for speaking to procurement professionals before starting to assemble your tender document pack. However, once you have consulted the right experts, then planning and preparing your tender documents can be very straightforward. There's a lot of detailed and complex thinking to go into properly defining what it is you require, but the process should be a breeze for a good project manager. In this video, I want to answer the question, what is a statement of work? A statement of work, often abbreviated as SOW, is a detailed and structured statement of what is required. It's often stated in terms of the work to be carried out, the products to be created, deadlines or milestones that we need to meet, and processes or procedures that we need to comply with. Most often, a statement of work is a contractual document, often appearing as an appendix to the main contract. This is because often we use a main contract again and again for multiple pieces of work, but each piece of work is different and therefore needs its own statement of work. Of course, the statement of work can include a load of other things. In fact, anything that the two contracting parties agree is appropriate to put within the statement of work. This could include things like the background to the project, specifications for the products or deliverables, or acceptance criteria or quality standards, financial measures, managerial or supervisory oversight measures, assumptions and variables, dependencies, or constraints, payment terms or other contractual matters, or work locations. The intention of a statement of work is to reduce risk in your project. It does this by introducing greater levels of clarity and by setting clear expectations on one or both parties. The parties will discuss and negotiate the details that need to go into the document, and then will draft the statement of work in a rigorous and meticulous manner. To further reduce the ambiguity and to make it easier to read, often statements of work are set out in a highly structured way. In developing a statement of work, we naturally start with a work breakdown structure. And it doesn't matter what form of work breakdown structure or WS dictionary we use. We could take a product-based work breakdown structure or an activity-based work breakdown structure and still achieve an effective and rigorous statement of work. Even if you don't start with your WBS as the basis for creating the statement of work, it will always make a lot of sense to reconcile it to your WBS dictionary. And of course, we have a full video on how to create a WBS, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Sometimes a statement of work is issued as part of tender or proposal documentations alongside the invitation to tender or the request for proposal. At other times, the ITT or RFP will contain a looser specification of the work to be done, and the negotiation of the detailed statement of work will happen with the preferred bidder in the run-up to creating, drafting, and ultimately signing the contract between the two parties. As you might expect, more formal tendering processes like those used by governments or international organisations tend to prefer the former, that is, documenting the statement of work and issuing it as part of the invitation to tender or request for proposal. And also, as you'd expect, I have a full video on the tender process, which I'll also link to in the description. What I've described so far is the most common form of a statement of work, and it's also known as a detailed statement of work or a design statement of work. There are, however, alternatives. A level of effort statement of work is most commonly used for service contracts, where what matters most is the inputs rather than the outputs. Input levels might include things like staff hours, or numbers of staff provided, or the materials to be used. We might see this, for example, in the context of portering or janitorial contracts. In the project management world, many contracts for consultants or freelance contractors will also take this input-based format. At the opposite end of the spectrum to the level of effort statement of work are alternatives to the statement of work principle itself. Things like a statement of objectives or performance work statements. These are becoming more and more popular because they place the emphasis firmly on the outcomes and are pretty agnostic about how you create those outcomes and what you put in terms of levels of effort, materials, or even the standards of the materials you use. What matters is the results you get. Indeed, we often see performance-based statements of work which make no statements about the processes or procedures to be used, but only the outcomes to be achieved. Of course, in the real world, performance-based statements of work will still need to contain any mandatory compliance-based processes or procedures. As a result, the labels you will see, whether it's a detailed statement of work or an effort-based statement of work or a performance-based statement of work, mean nothing. What really matters is what is contained in the statement of work. And the contents of the statement of work are there to provide absolute clarity about what a contractual party is expected to do to contribute to a project. Should a project manager get involved in contract negotiations? Well, that's the essence of a question I was asked. And it's an interesting question, and I thought you might want to hear my answer, which is, in summary, yes, absolutely we should. If we leave contract negotiations to procurement teams, then the results we get will be based on two principal considerations. Firstly, adherence to a set of procurement rules and regulations and policies. And secondly, on simple measures of value, like cost. In fact, I would argue that we should lead on the contract negotiations, leaving our procurement colleagues to act as enforcers, as the bad cop on important technical issues. These issues include things like the price, the terms and conditions, and of course, the wording of the contract. We need to get these right, they are essential. But for project managers, the thing that really matters is getting the right basic deal. And things go wrong. So as project managers, we need to be ready to step in if subsequently things do go wrong and they threaten to challenge an important relationship that can affect the way that we deliver our projects. Remember, that's what really matters, delivering our project. Everything else is just process and tactics. But if I make it sound like it's a bit adversarial between the project manager and the procurement manager, then I apologise. That's absolutely not my intention. You're on one team together, so plan the procurement campaign accordingly. Play to each of your strengths. Each of you has different expertise, and you should bring it together for the greater interest of the project, for your organisation, or for your client. And don't forget that your project sponsor can also play a valuable role in contract negotiations. They can be involved in the final closing of the negotiation to get the last few valuable concessions. And you can appeal to them to handle an intransigent procurement person who is too fixated on the details of policy and procedure and therefore likely to give up something that's really important and valuable to the project and to the organisation as a whole. We should never let pointless policy stop us from doing the right thing. Now, you might argue, correctly, that context is important too, and all of this has to depend upon the context. Bigger, more complex negotiations are more likely to need your involvement. For smaller, basic, fairly standard contracts, you can leave it to the procurement team to apply policy and get the best value. However, in my experience, as soon as contract negotiations start, people start to focus on positions. These positions are often long-standing and deeply ingrained, and they can lock up the negotiation and prevent the process from finding the best possible solution. Yet, by their very nature, projects are often trying to do something completely new. So focusing on established positions is exactly the wrong thing to do if you want to get the best result. It's not the role of procurement professionals to innovate. Their job is to protect. It's your role to innovate, to fight for something new and better. As in everything, the secret is balance. You need to work together to achieve it and to fine-tune it. Your responsibility is simple. It is to deliver your project so that it achieves the benefits and the value that your commissioning organisation, your sponsor or your client had envisaged for it. And if that means diving into the procurement process, and I believe it does, get ready to dive in. Project managers have always needed to be able to negotiate. It's part of our job. We're negotiating with stakeholders. We're negotiating with our sponsor, our boss, our client. We're negotiating with suppliers and contractors and consultants. And not only has it always been a part of our role, but it is increasingly being recognised by important bodies like the PMI. The PMI has now included explicitly within its examination content outline for the PMP qualification negotiation, which will become part of the examination from January 2021. It sits within Domain 1, People, and it's Task 8, Negotiate Project Agreements. So in this video, I want to talk you through the basics of negotiation for project managers. Negotiation is a process of searching for an agreement that satisfies all parties. And there are two important parts of that definition that I want to highlight. Firstly, it's a process, which means no matter how concerned you are that you may not be able to negotiate, if you follow the process, you will get a decent result. You can't predict what that result will be, but the process will get you there. And secondly, it's a process of searching for a solution that will satisfy all parties. This means that negotiation is a process that has integrity. You're not trying to get one over on the other party. That's cheating. You're looking to satisfy all parties. So if you're worried that negotiation feels somewhat uncomfortable, you don't need to, because your goal in negotiation is to produce an agreement that everyone will find acceptable. So what is the negotiation process? The negotiation process has 5 components to it. First, there's preparation. Then there's opening the negotiation. Then at the heart, there is bargaining. Then we close the negotiation. And finally, step 5 is to follow up on the negotiation. Preparation. Going into a negotiation unprepared is setting yourself up to fail. So think about the scope for the agreement you want and what are your goals and objectives for the negotiation. What do you want to achieve? What does a good outcome look like? In fact, you need to think about 3 levels of outcome to have in your mind going into the negotiation. The first is your ideal, the best reasonable outcome you could achieve. The second is an acceptable outcome, the sort of outcome you think you might achieve that would be acceptable. And finally, there's your bottom line, the minimum outcome you're prepared to achieve. Any outcome below that minimum outcome is worse than not negotiating at all, which means you have to know what your best alternative to a negotiated outcome is, your BATNA. Without knowing what you would do if the negotiation failed, you can't define your bottom line. And remember, any negotiation below that bottom line is just a negotiation about how much you're prepared to lose. There are 2 more things that you need to build into your preparation, and the first of those is research. You need to research the context. You need to research the players, the people, the history your organisation has had with their organisation. You need to find all of the facts. Make sure you've got them assembled and in good order so that you can access them as soon as you need them. And the second thing is to think about your negotiating strategy and tactics. How are you going to move from the start of the negotiation to a close in an orderly fashion? What concessions are you prepared to make, and what concessions are you likely to ask for? What are you going to focus on first, and what are the little details that you'll wrap up the negotiation with at the end? And how will the members of your team, if you're not negotiating as an individual but working with colleagues, how will they work together to make sure that the negotiation runs smoothly and you get the best you possibly can from it. Step 2 is opening, and there are 7 things you must cover at the opening of a negotiation. And whilst the order I'm going to present them in isn't absolutely fixed, it's a good order and it's one that will often make a lot of sense. Firstly, you have to make a good impression when you first meet the other negotiators from the other side. You must make a good first impression. You must come across as well prepared and professional. Secondly, you need to build rapport with them, because negotiation is a human-to-human activity. It's harder to cheat somebody you know, and it's easier to come to a satisfactory agreement when you know somebody well. So take time over the pleasantries, over the niceties of building a relationship. Third, you need to check the authority that the other person has to make an agreement, because if they don't have full authority, then chances are you need to reserve some concessions before getting to the final agreement with them, knowing that they may refer the draft agreement up to somebody with more authority who may then ask for further concessions. Next, you need to agree the basis for the meeting. Are we negotiating the whole transaction or a part of it? Are we looking for a draft agreement or a final agreement? What is the process by which we're going to confirm the agreement? And after that, you need to think about admin and ground rules. How are we going to conduct this negotiation? What are the arrangements around timing and timeouts? What's our agenda? What's our sequence? Who's going to sit where? And then we get to the nub. The 2 most important parts of the opening stage are what their ideal outcome is and what your ideal outcome is. And if possible, you should get them to share their ideal outcome first. That way, if necessary, you can mould your outcome, having heard what theirs is. But both parties will want to hear the other party's outcome first. So don't get yourself into a standoff. To the extent that any negotiation usually has someone who is more in the role of a seller and someone who is more in the role of a buyer, the usual default is that the seller will lead with their outcome first. When you've opened, the next step in the negotiation is the bargaining stage. And the bargaining stage moves through a number of phases. The parties will put their positions, they will explain them, and you will exchange ideas. This will lead to a number of offers. In response to those offers will be counter offers. There will be requests and offers of concessions. Sometimes you'll get stuck, and sometimes you'll find a way to get unstuck. But the bargaining stage will end when both parties feel they are close to an agreement. It's evident that most of the matters have been discussed, and there are offers and concessions and agreements around all of the different details. Now it comes to the close stage. At the close stage, we summarise where we've got to, and we check that all of the issues have been covered. If they have, we check one by one each component of the offer and all of the concessions are agreed by both parties. If it's evident that there is nothing more, or likely that there is nothing more, you can go for a trial close. If we've agreed all of this, are you ready to agree the whole package? Or, I believe we've agreed everything. On the basis of what we've just said, I'm happy to agree the package. You then make the formal offer. Are you prepared to agree this package? If, when you make your trial close, you get the wrong body language or the wrong signals, then you know you need to go back and find out what the issues are. If you get the right signals, then you can make your offer with a high degree of confidence that it's going to be accepted. And when the offer is accepted, confirm it and record the decision. At this point, there is nothing more you need to do to close the deal. Anything else you say can do nothing but poison the deal. So the only 2 things you must talk about after closing the deal are firstly the logistics of what comes next, what's going to be in the follow-up, And secondly, pleasantries. It's been nice doing business with you. If you mention anything else from the whole sphere of the negotiation, best case is the other party will go, yes, know that. Worst case is you'll introduce a new fact which will introduce doubt in their minds. So keep quiet. It's sometimes called by salespeople buying back the deal. You mention something else that you didn't mention. It turns out that that's not appealing to them. Once you've closed the deal, you must do all of your follow-up. You must do everything you committed to doing during the negotiation, and you must do it when you committed to doing it. Document the agreement, share it with both parties, share it internally with people within your organisation who need to know. As a courtesy, thank any of your colleagues who have been involved in the process, and as a courtesy, thank your counterparties as well. So there you have it, a simple 5-step process for negotiation. There's nothing mysterious, there's nothing complex about negotiation. It's the individual situations that create the complexity. But I hope now you'll feel confident to go into your next negotiation knowing what the stages are and how to manage it for a successful outcome. Vendor management is the process of working with vendors to get the things you need for your project when you need them, at a fair price, and to the specifications that you need. So, how can you work with your vendors to achieve this? I've already done a video on how to work with consultants. So in this video, I want to focus on the vendors that provide us with things like products, equipment, materials, and pro forma services. But perhaps I should start by answering the question, what is a vendor? A vendor is either the supplier of something you need or a reseller of it. Literally, a vendor is the person who sells something directly to you. Vendor relationship management, or VRM, is the process of managing the relationship, controlling the costs, managing the risks and the issues and the quality, and so achieving value from the relationship and from what the vendor has sold you. Vendor management, on the other hand, is a wider process. It also includes the selection of the vendor, contract management, and performance monitoring and evaluation. And the vendor management process starts with selection, choosing the right vendor. This starts with specifying the products and services that you need and doing so with great care. If you specify the wrong products and services, you'll probably choose the wrong vendor to supply them. Then you need to run a fair competition that complies with any rules and policies and legislation that your organisation is subject to. I've also done a video on running a tender process if you need to take a look at it. In choosing your vendor, I recommend that you select on value rather than on price, prejudice, or pretty presentations. And finally, be sure that you are happy with the terms of the contract or agreement before you sign anything and commit to the relationship with the vendor. Next, you need to establish the relationship with the vendor. It's always best to think of your vendor as a partner and to aim for an equal and collaborative relationship between the two of you. Be clear about your needs and your expectations and listen to theirs too. And don't just focus on the products, the goods, the services they're providing, but also around administration and liaison, because these are often where disagreements arise. Reflect any contractual terms in the working relationships that you set up. Be sure that you are absolutely clear about the roles and responsibilities of any named individuals within the contract and the people playing those parts. Set up liaison meetings and schedule them in advance so that everybody knows when they are and can make a commitment to attend. Make those meetings regular and as frequent as you need them to be to properly build the relationship and manage the contract. And things do go wrong, so establish emergency contacts for both parties and pay special attention to holiday periods, making sure that each party is able to contact the other if something goes wrong at precisely the most inconvenient time, because you can be pretty sure that if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. If it will go wrong, it's just as likely to go wrong at the wrong moment. And finally on this, find the best communication tool that you can use, or suite of tools that you can use, and actively consider whether it is appropriate to involve your vendor in your project collaboration tool. There may be good reasons not to do this, so think it through with great care. Next, be scrupulous in your dealings with your vendor. Be fair and be honest in your assessment of the work that they do, or the products or the materials, the goods that they deliver to you. And always meet your financial commitments in full and on time. And finally, there are probably some things you will need to properly support your vendor management processes. These include processes for time tracking, for cost tracking, and for reviewing deliverables and outcomes. And of course, you will need some form of KPIs or quality measures for the deliverables, for the outputs, for the services that they're providing. You'll need liaison processes that will enable you to share information, make corrections, learn lessons, reduce friction and waste, to handle misunderstandings, and if necessary, to handle disputes. But ultimately, the three things you will need are trust, transparency, and a collaborative mindset. There are vendor management software tools that you can call upon, and if you have them available, do take a look at them and evaluate them to see if they're going to help or hinder the process of engaging properly with your vendors. To close, I just want to reiterate the three things that I told you you will absolutely need: trust, transparency, a collaborative mindset. A huge challenge for us as project managers is that our timelines and sometimes our budgets can depend not on us and not on our teammates, but on our contractors and vendors. So in this video, I want to share some of my thoughts about the best way to manage vendors. The first thing to say is that managing vendors is all about the relationships. If you start with an adversarial relationship, if you start with an us and them mindset and attitude, then all you will get is constant competition, particularly if the contract contains penalties or sets you up for fault and blame. If, on the other hand, you start working collaboratively and you maintain that mindset throughout, and you set up a contract that rewards collaborative working, then that's what you'll get. You'll get what you look for and you'll get what you reward. If your attitude is towards collaboration, then you will find it easier to get collaboration and cooperation throughout your project, and better performance and results will be the consequence. I like a very simple project management philosophy. I don't care about the fault. I do care about the issues. That is to say, tell me about the problem as soon as you become aware of it, and we can talk about it, and we can work on it together, and we can resolve it. Don't try to blame someone else. And don't worry about me blaming you. Because whose fault is it won't get the problem fixed. What's the issue? And how can we work together to solve it? Will. So set incentives for all your contractors and for all your team members to work together. Allow them to share equally in any success. And compel them to work together to resolve any problems. Be generous and let people know that their best play is to work together and not start throwing blame around. As Leon Dager, Dustin Hoffman's character in the film Papillon, says, blame is for God and small children. On my projects, I know you're not one of those, and I don't expect you to behave like the other. Please give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll be creating loads more great project management content, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any of that content. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.